Hello everyone, this is Chris here, this time starting off with an announcement. With this video, I complete a playlist on ethics that gives the viewer a knowledge equivalent of 2 second-year or higher semesters of ethics, and the ethics requirement in most universities for a bachelor's degree in philosophy. My videos are related, so if you enjoy one, you can enjoy the others, so please check them out. Watching more than one video is a way to help out any channel. David Hume starts off Book 3 of his 1740 Treatise of Human Nature with the idea that morality is what interests us most, because the peace of society is something we fancy to be at stake. Because our passions are engaged, we naturally suppose that the moral question is within our comprehension, making the idea of moral distinctions appear real and solid. Nevertheless, Hume has previously determined in Book 1 of the treatise that our pretensions to absolute certainty regarding our opinions are not valid. Our opinions on matters of cause and effect, and the continued existence of an external object, are not as rock solid as we commonly assume. It is because we are mistaken about the true source of these ideas of necessary connection and continued existence. Even our theories of mathematics are not totally unquestionable in every sense, because we find we need to check our calculations and reasoning to increase our confidence, but cannot do so to infinity. Hume has become famous especially for this skepticism, but he wants to emphasize in his treatise that his is a moderate skepticism that recognizes that we still need to live our lives. Consistent with this, Hume will argue that moral distinctions are given to us neither by reason alone, nor by our knowledge of relations or matters of fact. Our ideas of good and evil, virtue and vice, are not the end products of a chain of disinterested reasoning or fact-finding, but instead have their source in a kind of sentiment. Under Hume's theories, all content of what is present in the mind is what falls under the category of perceptions. The two types of perceptions are impressions and ideas. Impressions are the immediate effects upon consciousness through our sense organs, or from within through our passions and emotions. Impressions are the more lively and forceful of the two types of perceptions. Our ideas are constructions of memory, thought, and imagination. Regarding objects, our ideas of them are faint images of them in thinking and reasoning. Hume will follow John Locke and George Berkeley in believing that even the most abstract concepts will have some origin in sense experience, rendering Hume what is now called an empiricist, an exponent of the belief that our knowledge of the world comes from sense experience. He says that all seeing, hearing, judging, loving, hating, and thinking falls under the denomination of perception, which is all that is present to the mind. This fact allows him to pose the question that will start his inquiry into morality. He says, whether 'tis by means of impressions or ideas that we distinguish betwixt vice and virtue, and pronounce an action blamable or praiseworthy. It was commonly believed that virtue consisted in conformity to reason or God, or that there exists some eternal fitness of things, or immutable measures of right and wrong that could be used to fix obligation on ourselves and the deity. Theories were popular that held that these things could be derived through juxtaposition and comparison of ideas. To judge these theories, Hume says we need only consider whether reason alone can distinguish between good and evil, or whether other principles are needed. At this point, Hume is fairly clear about what he means, but as he goes on, he will sometimes talk about reason, sometimes reason alone, and not use the phrase unaided reason. Either way, it will be reason without other principles that Hume wishes to prove to not be the source of moral distinctions. To answer the question, we will need to consider that morality involves practical reason, which is reason related to passions and actions. Speculative reason, by contrast, involves the judgments of the understanding, aimed at gaining knowledge. Now, it is confirmed by experience that men are often governed by their duties, and are deterred from some actions and impelled to others by the opinion of justice and its obligations. Hume concludes from these considerations that since our morals have an influence on our actions and affections, it follows that they cannot be derived from reason. How could it be that simple? Ultimately, he is saying that morality is active, while he believes reason to be inert in guiding action. Reason alone cannot have this influence on our passions and actions, according to Hume. He says on page 509, as long as it is allowed that reason has no influence on our passions and actions, 'tis in vain to pretend that morality is discovered only by a deduction of reason. An active principle can never be founded on an inactive, and if reason be inactive in itself, it must remain so in all its shapes and appearances, whether it exerts itself in natural or moral subjects. So far in this argument, one might easily misinterpret Hume and think that he is claiming that his division of subject matter between speculative and practical reason would alone justify a claim that reason is what he calls inactive. In other words, that reason's curiosity about abstract matters that do not call upon us to act implies that its curiosity about issues of justice and obligation cannot also determine the will. However, his position is actually not that, but something different and surprising. In a previous chapter on the influencing motives of the will, he goes into why it should be allowed that reason has no influence on our passions and actions. Hume's analysis disputes the traditional preeminence of reason over passions, that assumes that reason can control the passions, as, for example, in Plato's theory of justice in the individual, consisting in the reason governing the other parts of the soul. Hume starts his contrary argument by having the understanding assert itself in two ways. The first is by judging from demonstration or probability regarding either abstract ideas or relations of objects in experience. Its dominance is in the world of ideas, and because the will plants us in the world of realities, it seems to us that demonstration and volition are not related. But why then do we even want knowledge? A merchant wants to know the sum of his accounts with every person in order to ensure he pays his debts and collects the tabs of his customers. Demonstrative reason can only influence our actions indirectly through its directing of our judgments concerning causes and effects, which is the second function of the understanding. Hume will argue that this function has reason doing the bidding of the will, rather than governing it. In the prospect of pleasure or pain from any object, we feel an emotion in the form of a propensity to seek or avoid. Reasoning is to discover these relations and the emotions extending to the causes and effects of the object that we know from reason and experience. For example, we see fire, feel heat when close to it, feel pain if we touch it, which leads to a desire to avoid touching fire. If we are indifferent where action is required, without that propensity already operating, reason gives us discovery of the connection, and thus it cannot be by means of reason that objects affect us and make us want to embrace or avoid them. Reason alone is incapable of producing any action, or giving rise to or preventing a volition, or disputing the preference against any passion or emotion. Nothing can oppose or retard the impulse of a passion except the contrary impulse. If reason was the source of the contrary impulse, then the faculty of reason would have influence also upon the original will that it counters. Thus, a principle that opposes our passions is not the same thing as reason, but is called reason in an improper sense. In other words, it is a misuse of language to say that reason stepped in and countered a passion, because it would have influenced the original passion that it counters. And so Hume draws the conclusion from these considerations on page 462, a very famous quote. We speak not strictly and philosophically when we talk of the combat of passion and of reason. Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. It is instead the passion that is an original existence or modification of existence. It cannot be opposed by or be contradictory to reason. Propositions about fear, for instance, may be true or false, but the fear itself is neither one. Any contradiction could only exist in a disagreement of ideas that are mental copies of objects that they represent. It is a judgment that can be true or false. A passion can be founded on bad judgment in two ways, either by being founded on a supposition of existence of objects that do not exist, or by choosing means that are insufficient for a desired end, based on bad judgment of causes and effects. When a passion is not founded on false ideas of existence or cause and effect, the understanding can neither justify nor condemn it. It will then be only the judgment that can be considered to be unreasonable. And so Hume says, a passion must be accompanied with some false judgment in order to its being unreasonable. And even then, 'tis not the passion, properly speaking, which is unreasonable, but the judgment. So to give a brief summary of what we have, the practical reason that philosophers before Hume had supposed to be governing the passions and actions turns out instead to be governed by passions and our will, in determining what causes and effects will allow us to act to achieve our desires. But if reason is the slave of these passions, it cannot be alone what determines passions or actions. Reason is instead acting as a tool for the determination of means to an end. Therefore, moral distinctions of good or evil, virtue or vice, cannot be something we discover by a deduction of reason. If Hume is correct about this, in terms of his starting question of whether it be by impressions or by ideas that we distinguish between virtue and vice, this eliminates at least one way in which it could be ideas rather than impressions. Now that Hume has dealt with reason alone from its deductions, he will seek to show that an eternal immutable fitness or unfitness of things is not part of a sound moral philosophy. Reason discovers relations of objects and matters of fact that it observes. If thought and understanding alone were capable of moral valuation, the elements of virtue and vice would lie in either relations of objects or matters of fact. Comparison of ideas and inferring facts are functions of the understanding. Some philosophers have imagined that morality itself was to be demonstrable. For this to be so, now relations or matters of fact would have to be demonstrable. Hume considers himself to have already shown that no matter of fact can be demonstrated with certainty, and so if he is correct about this, we can infer that any virtue or vice that could be proven would have to be in the relations. For certainty and proof, we would have to confine ourselves to 4 relations out of the 7 that Hume identifies. The 4 relevant relations are resemblance, contrariety, degrees of quality, and proportions of quantity and number. The other 3 he leaves out are identity, space and time, and cause and effect. The 4 he considers belong as properly to matter as to our actions, passions, and volitions. In his view, morality does not lie in these relations, and our sense of morality is not in their discovery. His argument is that reason would have to comprehend a complicated array of factors of action and the situation, of which reason cannot be certain, in order to find virtue or vice in the relation. He starts his arguing for this by saying that those who make the claim that morality can be demonstrated do not hold that reason discovers in these relations that an act is virtuous or vicious. Reason discovers only the relations. If it were to discover also the virtue and vice, reason would have to discover virtue and vice in the whole complicated object of action and situation that has the relations wherein the essence of virtue and vice consists. Moral qualities themselves would have to become relations, and Hume summarizes this in a footnote on page 516. He says, "But here I think is plain argument. Demonstrative reason discovers only relations. But that reason, according to this hypothesis, discovers also vice and virtue. These moral qualities, therefore, must be relations. When we blame any action in any situation, the whole complicated object of action and situation must form certain relations wherein the essence of vice consists. This hypothesis is not otherwise intelligible. For what does reason discover when it pronounces any action vicious? Does it discover a relation or a matter of fact? These questions are decisive and must not be eluded." Despite this, he considers the possibility that someone may be thinking that our sense of morality may be found and demonstrated in some relation other than those that Hume has discovered. He challenges someone to discover it and clean up the system. By doing so, he sets up what is a second argument against morality founded upon a relation in setting up 2 conditions that must be met in order to find the essence of virtue and vice in this new relation. Hume regards both of these conditions as being both necessary and impossible. Essentially, one must first show the relations upon which a distinction between virtue and vice can be founded, and secondly, to prove a priori, independently of sense experience, that the relations would be universally obligatory. The first condition is that the relations from which moral distinctions arise must lie only between internal actions of the mind and external objects. It must not compare internal actions with internal actions or objects with objects. This is because good and evil belong only to actions of the mind derived from the situation regarding external objects. If morality was to attend certain relations, these relations that belong singly to internal actions could lead us to be guilty of crimes independently of a situation. Similarly, relations between only external objects would have us ascribing to even inanimate objects a specifically moral beauty or deformity. Hume says it is difficult to imagine any relation being discovered between passions, volitions, actions, and external objects that do not also belong to these items compared among themselves. The second condition would be even more difficult to establish in order to justify a system of abstract differences between good and evil based on natural fitness in relations. Those relations that are conceived as eternal and immutable must be the same for every rational creature. The effects, in addition, must also be the same for all, with no greater or lesser influence on directing the will of the deity. These two particulars of knowing virtue and conforming the will to it are distinct. The problem then becomes how such an eternal and immutable abstract morality can be demonstrated. Hume says of this on page 517, "'Tis one thing to know virtue, and another to conform the will to it. In order, therefore, to prove that the measures of right and wrong are eternal laws, obligatory on every rational mind, 'tis not sufficient to shew the relations upon which they are founded. We must also point out the connection betwixt the relation and the will, and must prove that this connection is so necessary that in every well-disposed mind it must take place and have its influence." So regarding the first condition, Hume will conclude that a relation cannot be found that just relates internal actions to objects, without any other relations of actions or objects to each other. He also concludes that we cannot prove a priori that these relations would be universal and obligatory. Hume hopes to give his readers more clarity and more forcefully convince them by means of particular examples of vicious actions of patricide and incest. Whether the guilt or moral deformity of these actions is determined by reason or felt by a moral sense, their evil is acknowledged by all of mankind. He says that the theory that morality comes from reason discovering it in the relations is shown to be false if the same relations in other objects is found not to have guilt or iniquity attending them. If the same relations have different moral characters, it follows that those characters are not discovered merely by reason. In the case of patricide, an oak or elm tree drops its seed that produces a sapling which eventually overtops and destroys the parent tree. One tree causes the existence of the other, which destroys it. These are the same relations that exist in human patricide. Hume will not accept the objection that the trees lack will or choice, because the will being the cause of the action does not change the relations. The same relations occur even with a different internal cause. The question at hand is still whether reason can discover a vice in the relations. The question of incest produces relations that are even more resembling. Why is human incest considered criminal when the very same actions and the same situation in animals have not the slightest moral turpitude? We see this in dogs in our own time, where a purebred dog really should be called inbred. Someone may object here that animals lacked sufficient reason to discover this turpitude. But Hume counters by saying that this objection argues in a circle. The turpitude must exist in order for reason to discover it. According to the system implied by this objection, every animal that has sense, appetite, and will must be susceptible to the same virtues and vices for which we ascribe praise or blame. Our superior reason may serve to discover that virtue or vice, but that still presupposes a separate being of the moral distinctions. The being of those distinctions depends upon will and appetite, distinct from reason. The duties and obligations on animals would continue to exist, with or without their discovery. I would identify the kill shot of his argument where he says on page 520, animals are susceptible of the same relations with respect to each other as the human species, and therefore would also be susceptible of the same morality, if the essence of morality consisted in these relations. One way of understanding Hume's counter to the objection pertaining to incest, that animals lack reason, is to ascribe to the objecting theory an inconsistency or a false assumption. If anyone would believe that incest is worthy of blame in humans, but not in animals, and at the same time believes that human reason discovers vice in the relations, that person is inconsistent or is reasoning under a false assumption that the relations are different. It is unclear why Hume says that the objection argues in a circle rather than creating an inconsistency, because he does not draw the circle. Either way, the examples he gives of patricide and incest are to illustrate and give more convincing force to his theory that morality cannot be discovered in the relations, because the relations are the same in a situation where our moral valuation is different. It also harkens back to his earlier statement that if virtue or vice were in the relations must only be just between internal actions of the mind and external objects, or we would sometimes be forced to ascribe a moral deformity even to inanimate objects. Now that Hume has disposed of the possibilities of reason discovering morality through deduction, and reason discovering it in the relations, he now moves on to the remaining possibility that moral distinctions consist in some matter of fact that can be discerned by the understanding. It is less complicated to prove that virtue and vice are not found in matters of fact. Observe a willful murder, and you will not see anything that we can call vice. We can feel horror, we can disapprove of the act, we declare the consequences undesirable, but we do not witness the vice in it. What we do find is passions and thoughts within ourselves, or a sentiment against murder. It is a sentiment of feeling, not reason, that only exists internally, not in the object. When we pronounce an action to be vicious or evil, we only mean that we form a sentiment of blame from contemplation of it. Like colors, sound, heat, and cold, virtue and vice are not qualities of objects, but perceptions in the mind. And so finally, now that it is also established that we cannot infer moral distinctions from matters of fact and sense experience, moral distinctions are not derived from reason. Hume concludes this section with an important observation for which he is famous. In every system of morality he has met with, the author starts with the propositional copulas of is and is not, and then relates them to an ought or ought not. The change to ought and ought not expresses a new relation or affirmation, and is not accompanied by reasons why it could even be conceivable how this new relation could be a deduction from the other that is entirely different. For Hume, it is not just that an is does not imply an ought, but rather that none of the 8 possible combinations of any one from either pair with any other from the other pair is valid. Descriptive and normative statements are expressing different relations. This principle is sometimes called Hume's law, or more commonly the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic part involves an idea of what is natural, or that to which most of us are naturally inclined. You can sometimes hear it called the fact-value dichotomy. The fallacy is the mistake of inferring conclusions about what ought or ought not to be from premises that only state what is or is not the case, or the other way around. In reverse direction, it is sometimes called a moralistic fallacy, to infer what is true from what one believes ought to be true. And this is the method of cancel culture, to invalidly moralize against factual disagreement on the basis of what they believe ought to be true. In Hume's terms, it introduces a new relation or affirmation, without reasons why the deduction that infers an is from an ought is conceivable. So Hume's reasoning leads him to conclude that morality is not derived from reason or from comparison of ideas. It must therefore be from some internal impression or sentiment that they occasion when we note the difference between vice and virtue. He draws this inference by process of elimination, that our decisions about moral rectitude come from a perception that is not an idea. And so he says, morality, therefore, is more properly felt than judged of, though this feeling or sentiment is commonly so soft and gentle that we are apt to confound it with an idea. He has already hinted at this impression being of the nature of a pleasure or pain that we feel upon contemplation of the virtuous or vicious act. And so it is a kind of compound impression of reflection. Hume regards our feeling of virtue as a special kind of pleasure that is different than the pleasure of a good piece of music or bottle of wine. The good here of the wine is not its harmoniousness, and the good of the music is not its taste. And therefore, there must be a resemblance of these goods by which we use the same term. It must be a pleasure of a peculiar kind, or otherwise the objection could be raised that if virtue and vice were determined by pleasure or pain, those qualities would arise from sensations, and thus be matters of fact. As it happens, it is not the same as every other sentiment of pleasure or pain arising from characters or actions. An enemy's good qualities may harm us, but may still command our esteem and respect. And so Hume says that 'tis only when a character is considered in general, without reference to our particular interest, that it causes such a feeling or sentiment, and denominates it morally good or evil. If Hume is correct, it means that reason alone, in determining truth or falsity, can only determine truth or falsity regarding matters of fact, or validity in purely theoretical matters. It could not extend its domain into the truth or falsity about statements of value and overrule a feeling that something must be good or bad. Hume's ideas on these matters have been very influential in the English-speaking world after him, and also among Vienna's logical positivists, who are part of the early analytic philosophy movement in the 20th century. In Germany, Immanuel Kant, shortly after Hume's death, took the route that Hume advises against, and sought to establish a supreme principle of morality based on reason alone. As far as we know, Kant never read the treatise, and the comparison between him and Hume is an interesting one. I've covered Kant's morality in another video. Kant also thought of the necessity to avoid basing morality on anything empirical, which was his way of avoiding the naturalistic fallacy. However, he did seek to derive the moral law in a way that Hume seems to have missed as a possibility, and consists in noting that our concept of morality is bound up in universal law. Hume recognizes this when he demands that relations, if they did ground moral distinctions, be proven a priori and be universal. If morality consists in universality like this, then the subjective principle or maxim of an act must be something I can will to be a universal law of nature, having everyone act the same. This categorical imperative to only choose maxims that are good by being something I can will that everyone does becomes itself a principle that commands, rather than advising about causes and effects. As for Hume's contention that reason becomes a slave of the passions, it is something I find difficult, unless it would be confined to very simple examples of the type of hypothetical cause and effect reasoning for a specific goal. If a student wants good grades, reason can find a cause and effect relation that says he should attend all classes to fulfill that desire. Here it seems that reason is a tool for a desire, just like Hume claims. If I have a passion for a character or higher order desire, such as being a tyrant or wanting power, the situation may not be so simple. Reason can tell me that there may be risks involved in angering my fellow men, or, as Plato suggests in his Gorgias, I might in reality be conforming to and serving them, and also that lying can be a way to fulfill such a desire. If I think that lying cannot be permissible, it seems to me that reason can play a dual role under which it can sometimes destroy or retard the impulse of a passion, and it is not a misuse of language to say that reason stepped in. In this case also, it is an original passion that is not founded on mistaken ideas, but instead is created prior to inquiry. Consequently, the understanding can condemn a passion, and Hume gives no reason to believe that reason must always influence the first passion in the series. This is not a chicken and egg question. If reason is a tool that needs to be motivated to inquiry, which is one of Hume's premises, some passions must exist prior to that inquiry. What Hume has proven, therefore, is only that reason can and often will do the bidding of the will, not that it must always do so. Well, I hope I have given some understanding of some of the depth of thought and originality that makes a treatise of human nature a great work of philosophy. In terms of its reading difficulty, I would describe it as beyond beginner level, but not by a high degree. It does represent an influential revolution against traditional philosophy that is very well thought out. Well, that's all for now. If you liked it, hit those like and subscribe buttons. Check out my other videos, and thanks for watching.